I'm Marita Trehemovich. I'm with the City of Tacoma in their Environmental Programs Group, and I'm the moderator for this session, which is Direct to Implementation Approach to Toxic Reduction in the Spokane River. We have a joint presentation this morning by Adriane Borgias and Lynn Schmidt. Adriane works for the Department of Ecology, and she's working on the efforts in the Spokane River with the goal of reducing toxics to the river. She has a degree in chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in environmental science from the University of San Francisco. Lynn Schmidt is a professional engineer and the stormwater permit coordinator for the City of Spokane. She coordinates compliance with the Phase 2 Municipal Stormwater Permit and the city's PCB Adaptive Management Plan, and the city's involvement in the Spokane River Regional Toxics Task Force. So it's a joint presentation today. Adriane will be going first, and then Lynn. At the end of their presentation, there'll be time for some questions if anyone has any. Thanks for joining us this morning. Adriane?
Thank you, Marita. I'll be the first to tell you I'm not an expert on stormwater. I'm sort of a generalist, actually. So I've learned a lot these past couple days, and I've been going to the sessions on social marketing, and I find the really fascinating parallel between that and the scientific method. So it's been very interesting, and one of our challenges actually as we move forward will be that aspect of social marketing. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the kind of an evolution of the history of PCB in the Spokane River and how we found it and what we've done over time, the water quality standards, and why those are a challenge for us from both a technical and a regulatory aspect. Then I'll introduce you to our Spokane River Regional Toxics Task Force, which is a collaborative effort that's intended to address these challenges. And lastly, measurable progress. The Ecology has the responsibility to see how this process goes in terms of an accountability aspect, and I'll briefly touch on how we measure progress, or how we plan to measure progress, let's put it that way. So the studies on the Spokane River have been going on for a long time, and in fact really back to the original era when they first started to regulate PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. And those studies really originally focused on more of an ecological aspect, the questions about are there PCBs in wildlife, how are they affecting them, fish, and the health risks. And in 1996, the river was listed as water quality limited for PCBs under the Clean Water Act, which means it didn't meet the water quality standards. And then in 2001, the Department of Health issues the first fish consumption advisory, and those listings and advisories have been in effect since those times. Just really briefly, I'm sure most of you here know what PCBs are, but there's also a certain amount of glossary or vocabulary that goes along with that, especially as you become more looking at it in greater detail. So it's polychlorinated biphenyl, so it's two benzene rings, those are phenyl rings, connected together. And you can look at that molecule and see that there are 10 locations where chlorines can be substituted. So a little bit of math, you can figure out that there are 209 possible polychlorinated biphenyls. We often hear them referred to as aerochlors. Those are the technical mixtures that were created from 1920 until about 1979, and they were used primarily in electrical applications because they had a high they didn't burn easily. They had a high resistance to burning, and they also were not very electrically conductive. So aerochlors, there's a number of different aerochlors, and you'll see aerochlor with a number, 4-digit number, that actually refers to the percentage of chlorine in the aerochlors, and they can be identified by a specific signature during the analytical process. Then you might also hear the term homologs, and those are aerochlors that all have the same molecular weight. So any of the monochlorinated PCBs will be one homolog, dichlorinated, trichlorinated, etc. So there are 10 homologs because there are 10 possible substitutions. Lastly, you might also hear the term toxic equivalents, TEQs. So certain PCBs, and there are about, I think there are 12 of them, are considered to be more toxic than others because they are structurally very similar to dioxin. And so what they've done is they've done some toxicity studies, and they relate the toxicity of these 12 congeners of PCBs to the dioxin molecule. And so if you are doing cleanups, et cetera, this TEQ becomes more significant because that's actually how some of the health risk assessments are done. This is the Spokane River. It is 111 miles long. It starts really at the outlet of Lake Coeur d'Alene, and that's the blue spot you see on the right. I realize this is a very busy slide. It is actually a copy of the information the health department puts out to discuss fish advisories. So as you move towards the left on the slide, you see the red area. The red area is an area that is do not eat fish because of PCB concentrations. That area happens to be where most of the industrial facilities in our valley are located. And you can see a light blue, kind of a light blue blotch all over that picture there, and that light blue blotch is our aquifer. So we have a very large, fast-flowing aquifer, and it is a sole source aquifer. It provides drinking water for a population of about 600,000 in the whole region. And the aquifer has an intimate connection with the river. In places it flows into the river flows into the aquifer, and in other places the aquifer flows into the river, and that it can actually change over the times of the year as the river water level itself goes up and down. It creates a very complicated scenario, and it's actually one of those things that we really need more information about to understand it better. You can also see there are a number of dams along the river, and below Upriver Dam is an area that's yellow. That yellow area also has a PCB advisory, although it is less stringent, and the green area as well, moving on down the river. And these different boxes on here give different instructions about how to fix fish and how many fish you could eat a month. You see the brown area at near the far left side of the picture, and that is the Spokane Indian Reservation. So our water quality standards are not just the state of Washington, but also the standards of the Spokane Tribe of Indians. And so we'll touch on that in this talk today in terms of what that means. The other thing I think you can notice is that it's really a highly segmented river. We have a number of dams along the way, and that segmentation can actually help us understand where some of the sources of PCBs might be in the river. Just to give a little bit of comparison where the Spokane River fits in the rest of the state, some people will say it is the most polluted river in the state. Some of that information comes from reports that are about 14 years old. A more recent understanding is that, yes, we do have concentrations that range from around 64 to about 300 or 650 parts per quadrillion in the river. But we can also see that there are some other rivers in the area in our state that are challenged with respect to water quality. On the left-hand side, you can see the different standards. So the water quality standard in Washington currently for PCB is 170 parts per quadrillion. Below that is the EPA recommended criterion, which is below the 170, and that's 64 parts per quadrillion. And the Spokane Tribe of Indians water quality standard is 1.34 parts per quadrillion. And really the difference in all of these is how much fish is consumed. The calculation that goes into fish consumption is really what drives the differences in those numbers. If we look at what this means from a regulatory challenge, in general terms, PCB is regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act. In general terms, they have a 50 part per million standard. So if we change that to parts per billion, it's 50,000 parts per billion. And so very generally, substances that have less than 50 parts per billion are generally not regulated as stringently as substances that are over that. And so we do have a situation where we have the potential of PCB coming from something that's regulated under TSCA, and TSCA will call it non-PCB, but it is regulated, but it is present. We also have a standard under our Model Toxics Control Act here in Washington of 1 part per billion for residential soil cleanup. We have the surface water quality standard of 0.00017 parts per billion. That's the same number you saw earlier, it's just in parts per billion. And then on the far right is the Spokane Tribe water quality standard. Down below, fish tissue, 5.3 parts per billion. That's the level at which the health department begins to look at this and say, are we going to need fish advisories on this water body or not? And then 0.01 is the groundwater standard. And I think the key message to take from this slide is that TSCA's allowable PCB concentrations are 38 billion times higher than our water quality standards. And by that I mean that we are allowing PCBs still today to be manufactured, and they still have the ability to enter our waters, and it becomes a big challenge if we're trying to achieve water quality standards if we still have a source that's being created. From 2003 to 2007, the Department of Ecology did a study of the Spokane River, so bear that in mind. This data is over 10 years old at this point. Looking at the sources and pathways of PCB to the river, and there's a big part of that pie that says 57%, and that's unknown. That's either unknown because we just don't know what that source might be. It might be from air. Hard to calculate that. It might be from groundwater. You talked about the aquifer interactions. We haven't figured all that out, and that's a huge data gap in our understanding of how the river works and how PCB moves through the river. We also have a percentage from Idaho of 13%, so that's where the river comes into Washington State from Idaho. Idaho sources consist also of the stormwater, atmospheric, snowmelt, whatever that contribution might be, plus 3 dischargers that discharge into the river in Idaho. And then you can see the stormwater connection here, 19% has been related to stormwater. 8% municipal industrial discharges, and 3% the Little Spokane River. Now, I think it's really important to note that that 57% contains a high percentage of unknown because we're measuring a river that is highly dynamic. We take a few measurements of substances that are very low concentrations, and then we go and make these generalizations about it. And that's the real technical challenge. How do you measure something that low, has a high level of uncertainty around the individual analysis, plus a high level of uncertainty around the flows, regimes over the course, even over the course of a day, in a river that's controlled by a variety of factors, including dam operations, weather, etc. So you can see it becomes a big challenge to do what's called a loading analysis. However, because the water quality standard is so low, we look at that 99% load reduction would be necessary to meet it. So it can't take too much thinking to realize that we really have to do a lot of different things to answer this question. First, we need to understand our data gaps. We need to look at the history and understand how that works. And we need to do some phase studies to parse out what these unknowns are. And frankly, we have 20 years of experience looking at this. So we do have some existing studies, and we can look at those maybe in a more sophisticated way, go back and do some data mining and find out, look at congener data maybe in a different way to see if we can answer questions as to where the sources of PCB in the river are from, and then modeling as a way to sort of fill in some of those gaps. We realize that achieving water quality standards at that level, 1.34 parts per quadrillion, is going to require some innovative thinking and long-term partnerships, and a suite of technical and regulatory tools, some of which we have, some of which we're pushing for. We also need to have that meaningful stakeholder involvement, and I heard a presentation in the last session about the storm process, and I thought that that was really a good example of how that works, and that to some extent is how it works for us too. And that includes, once we identify these sources and identify the public contribution, a widespread education and outreach program. So lastly, I just want to point out, you saw that conflict between TSCA and our water quality standards, and really, for us to achieve this, we do need reform at all levels. That is the federal, that is the state, and at local levels as well. In 2012, these entities on this slide, which includes government agencies, dischargers, and environmental groups, signed a Memorandum of Agreement to work together. And the reason they signed that agreement was that previous to that, there'd been about 11 years of dissension and lawsuits and disagreement over the dissolved oxygen, TMDL, the total maximum daily load allocation in the river. And everybody realized that that really is kind of a waste of resources to spend the time fighting it, especially when we all knew that we needed to reduce PCBs, and that should be the focus of the efforts. So the vision of the Spokane River Regional Toxics Task Force is to work collaboratively to characterize the sources of toxics in the Spokane River, to identify and implement appropriate actions needed to make measurable progress towards meeting applicable water quality standards for the state of Washington, the state of Idaho, and the Spokane Tribe of Indians. As we move forward, Ecology has the accountability piece for this, and we have spent some time trying to answer the question, what is measurable progress? How do we do that? How do we measure it? What is it? And after meeting with the stakeholders and taking all the different feedback from everybody, which honestly was all over the board, right? If somebody said left, someone else said right. If somebody said green, somebody else said, what's the opposite of green? Red. It just went on. And so we began to realize that there were a number of different components to this measuring progress. The key being metrics. What can we measure? What are the metrics? Well, we can measure inputs. We can measure what people are doing. And obviously, in a collaborative effort, doing something is important. If people aren't doing, you aren't getting anything done, right? So we cannot discount the fact that being able to work together and organizing the activities is very important. The second measure that we looked at were outputs. So we're doing, but are we doing effectively? Are we doing reports? Are we answering those questions? Are we doing some of the hard things we need to do to achieve reductions? And then the third part of that is outcomes. Are we achieving the goal? And that's the focus on the progress aspect. One of the big challenges, and I heard this mentioned in another talk today, is that outcomes is not necessarily a 24-hour period of time that you could say, yes, I did this and I got that. In fact, it's not even a 1 year. It might even be a 10-year. We don't know for sure. It's very difficult for us to predict. How long will it be before we do this activity, make this reduction, and see this outcome in concentrations of PCB in fish in the river? And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Lynn.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about how the City of Spokane, a member of the Toxics Task Force, has worked on toxics reductions in the Spokane River and what our idea of measurable progress is and how we've input that. Here's a picture of the city. I think it's really good because it shows the Spokane River flowing right through town. We have something of about 20 miles of the river flowing through the city of Spokane and a lot of urban area that drains to it. So here is our Cleaner River Faster is the objective of the Integrated Clean Water Plan. And this is kind of how we've gotten into toxics reductions and all the work that the city has been doing. It started with a catalyst and a consent decree with the Spokane River Keeper over PCB concentrations in our stormwater and combined sewer overflow. There were 5 supplemental environmental projects that came from that, such as low impact development ordinance and storm drain markers and those kinds of things. And then we also did extensive PCB trackdown studies. The collaboration piece is our work with the Spokane River Regional Toxics Task Force. That began in 2011. That was actually a requirement of our waste discharge permit for the treatment facility that we have in Spokane. So we were required to join the task force, and then the task force is required to make measurable progress to toxics reductions in the river instead of going through this litigation process and just the 10-year struggle that we had with the DO, TMDL, and getting waste load allocations. Instead, we're trying to see what we can do to make progress right away. So the Integrated Clean Water Plan really embodies the City of Spokane's progress. We just adopted that this year in March of 2014. It was completely voluntary. And that came up with a set of actions that we didn't just focus on toxics, but pollution reduction in general, and took a step back and looked at our entire system and where we can make the biggest impact. So here's a map of how the city manages our stormwater. We have a little bit of everything, an MS4 system on the north side of the river, a combined sewer system on the south side of the river, and then in the newer developed areas, it's primarily infiltration and UICs and some evaporation where we can't infiltrate. And this is found to be one of the major pathways for PCBs to enter the river, which is pretty self-explanatory, but yeah. All right, so the PCB consent decree, we were required to identify and reduce PCBs that were coming to the Spokane River. So we focused on the most contaminated basins where Ecology had done some sampling and found that our PCB concentrations were quite a bit above the water quality standards. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And then we also did 5 supplemental environmental projects. So we came up with a low impact development ordinance, and that encourages low impact development in the city of Spokane. It doesn't require it, but we give discounts on our stormwater fees for people who implement low impact development. And then we've also adopted the Eastern Washington LID guidance manual is kind of a guidance on how to go about doing that. We gave a grant to the Rose Foundation to do projects to impact the health of the Spokane River, and a storm drain marking program. These are what our storm drains look like. They just kind of point to where each drain goes to. We've got a different sticker for each one of our systems, and then our hotline number on there. We provided a GIS layer and then a stormwater educational guide for people to understand what the stormwater problem is and how they can get through the permitting process. And then our integrated clean water plan, I'm sure like a lot of the other jurisdictions, we had a lot of different programs going on, some for MS4, some for our CSO, for our treatment plant, and they were just kind of going along on their own click. And so the city decided, you know, it's costing us somewhere around $500 million to do all these programs. So just wanted to take a step back and look at them all holistically and see where we can get the biggest bang for our buck, basically, where we can integrate these different programs and prioritize our pollutant reductions. And so some of the projects that we came up with was the Cochrane Stormwater Basin is really large. It's about half of our MS4 system, about 5,300 acres that drain to that. And so we're looking at putting in a centralized treatment near the outfall, and that's significant PCB reductions that'll come from that. And then our CSO control facilities, we have to do those by 2017. Each of our basins have to be down to 1 overflow per outfall per year. So we're going to install those. And then we noticed if we operate, we're installing a tertiary treatment at our wastewater treatment plant, and that only for the dissolved oxygen TMDL, it only has to be run during the critical growing season. So if we actually operate that year-round, you get quite a significant PCB reduction because just the volume, basically, it's 30 million gallons a day on average during dry weather that goes there. So that's quite a bit of PCBs when it all adds up. And then we've implemented a stormwater policy in the city to treat and infiltrate stormwater wherever possible. Whenever we do a street project, we'll look at the stormwater whenever we do a water project, and the city has actually formed an entirely new department. We have an integrated department. So they took out our main wastewater engineer and the water department engineer and all the capital programs people. And whenever we do a project, they look at everything. So we only want to rip up the road one time, basically, and get as much out of a project as we can. So this all kind of amounts to our measurable progress that we're working on. We've also put together a PCB purchasing ordinance, and that really mimics what the state did with their PCB purchasing bill. We went a little bit above and beyond in requiring using this really low detection limit, EPA method 1668, and that gets down to the parts per quadrillion level. So if you test a lot of products for PCBs using method 8082, it's a kind of high detection. You're really not going to find much. So it is really helpful to use this method, although it's really expensive. It's about $800 each sample. So we adopted the ordinance this summer, and we're working on the policy right now to implement it. It's going to be put into our environmental preferred purchasing policy. And this is just, I don't have time to go into this in big detail, but this was our PCB trackdown studies in the heavy industrial portion of the city. This is on the east side of downtown. And so these are the basins. We've got an MS4 basin and part of a CSO basin here and some infiltration areas that we were looking at testing catch basin sediments. And by doing that, we were hoping to track down hot spots And we really, unfortunately, we found PCBs everywhere, and it just was not apparent where they were coming from. There's one spot where there's a known PCB cleanup site, that city parcel site up there, in the green dot up there. That's was a former transformer repair facility. So we're working on further remediation and focus in that area, but the rest are not so apparent. So after we did all the sampling in 2010, 2011, we cleaned out every single catch basin, we cleaned out several of the stormwater lines, and then we came back a couple years later and sampled the same spots again, and we found that there was almost the same amount of PCBs coming in to the same spots. It's a little bit less, but within, error of about the same concentrations. So there's a continual source of PCBs in the area. It wasn't fixed by just cleaning it out. We also did some stormwater sampling. These are the various basins that we sampled. This big purple blob is the Cochrane Basin that I talked about. We sampled the Washington Basin, which is on the north side of downtown. That's a heavy urban area. And then towards the east side of downtown, those are our heavy industrial areas, the Union Basin and the CSO 34. And then CSO 6 on the northwest side is a more residential CSO basin. And here are the results. Ecology did a study in a town just east of Spokane called Liberty Lake, and it was developed more recently, so they figured this is probably an urban background concentration of stormwater. So that's the red lines in the bottom. And this is in picograms per liter, just for comparison to our water quality standards. So the Liberty Lake study found about 1 to 10,000 picograms per liter of PCBs in stormwater. And you can see our Cochrane Basin, the third one here, we call it our average city stormwater because it goes over so many different areas of the city. It's within that range. And then our Washington Basin, the commercial area is a little bit elevated. And then obviously we've got our heavy industrial areas that are quite a bit elevated over what we are considering urban background. And then the CSOs are just slightly above. We're also sampling our wastewater, and we're finding a little bit more PCBs in our wastewater than stormwater. And just entirely different sources, but it could be in your toothpaste or your shampoo or whatever. So here are some correlations for our PCB concentrations in stormwater over time. And I know this is a lot of data, but if you just look at it, this is over about a 2-year period, and you can see the PCB concentrations are kind of mimicking each other in the different basins. So when you correlate this with wind patterns, we're seeing when we have really high winds, the PCB concentrations in all of the basins are picking up. So one thing we really want to look at is doing an aerial deposition study because it could be a big source in this basin. All right, so the Union Basin, MS4, that was the heavy industrial basin. We're just finding that PCBs are ubiquitous, and it's going to be really difficult to track every single source down. So the solution that we've come up with is just treating and infiltrating the stormwater. And we looked at the San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute BMP toolbox for reducing PCBs. There's actually one of those. And so they recommended bioretention. So that's what we're doing right now. That's in design and should be constructed next year, I believe. And we're also doing some product sampling to get at the true sources of PCBs. So here's a few products that have been tested and are known to have inadvertent PCBs produced. Pigments, particularly the diarylide yellow, if I can say that right, found in blue and green and yellow paint, and Ecology found it in snack packaging and even your yellow mustard if it has pigment in it. They found PCBs in that. Titanium dioxide with the white pigment has PCBs, silicone, and then the city actually did some testing for motor oil and hydraulic fluid, and we found a substantial amount of PCBs, of course, under the TSCA threshold, but the highest full synthetic 5W30 oil had 116 parts per billion PCBs. So the Fix Your Leak campaign, I think, would work well in Spokane, something we should look at. And then there's a host of other products that are likely to contain PCBs, and these are basically in a manufacturing process that combines chlorine and carbon and high heat. You have the potential to make PCBs inadvertently. They don't do it on purpose. So the city got a gross grant to test PCBs in products. It's a stormwater grant, so we're testing products that can come into contact with stormwater. So a couple of things we're looking at are road paint, yellow and white road paint. We're testing a couple different products that different jurisdictions use around the state, and then we're also testing our thermoplastic tape. I also wanted to look at hydrant paint with the aluminum color in it, and utility locate paint. We're interested in firefighting foam, de-icer, vehicle wash soap. We're testing a number of different pesticides and herbicides that can have PCBs in them. 2,4-D is one of them, an approved aquatic herbicide, so that'll be really interesting. And then we're testing motor oil, both new and used, diesel and gasoline, if we can. We've had a hard time shipping that across the border. Our lab is in Canada, so. We're looking at dust suppressant. Both what the city of Spokane uses is magnesium chloride, and then we're looking at WashDOT's sugar beet boost, and I'm kind of hoping that'll be one of our PCB-free alternatives. Antifreeze, lubricant, a number of different asphalt products, and then the actual pipe that we build our stormwater systems out of, PVC, and then the liners that we use to repair the system. So I was hoping to have some results. They went to the lab. The first ones went to the lab about 6 weeks ago, so they should be trickling in anytime soon. So I'll be sharing those when I can. I don't quite have them yet. Here's just a couple pictures of the different samples that were taken. And then we have a nice system. Our facilities maintenance people maintain, most of our city trucks. So we have a nice bulk oil that goes into most of our trucks, and then we can get that same bulk oil that's coming out of the trucks after they've been used and test both of them. And there's a theory that perhaps our engines are acting like little PCB scavengers. So we'll see maybe if there's an increase in PCB over time. That'll be really interesting. And there's a picture of our dried paint. Perhaps I did dried and liquid paint just to see if PCB, some congeners are volatilizing into the air and what those might be. So results are pending. So like I mentioned, we found that PCBs are really widespread and diffuse all over the city in every basin that we tested. We're working with the Toxics Task Force, and one thing we should really look into is an aerial deposition study, because I think that could be a major source to stormwater. And then our integrated clean water plan, our measurable progress piece, and the different projects that I talked about with that a little bit. And we're also working with the Toxics Task Force for long-term funding to facilitate measurable progress, both for the city of Spokane and the Toxics Task Force as a whole. So I'll give it back to Adriane.
Thank you. So now you can see what a challenge it is to get that 37% or so of PCBs that are inputs to the river. So let's just ramp this up to maybe that bigger question of what's the challenges from a watershed perspective. That 1.37 parts per quadrillion standard, that is below the detection limits of the most sensitive analytical methods. So basically, we can't measure water and identify whether or not we've met the water quality standard. That's a huge technical challenge. It's also very expensive. Lynn mentioned $800. That's when you get the discount. If you just get a single sample, it's probably around $1,500 per sample. Funding isn't guaranteed for our organization. So far, it's been funded by a mixture of Ecology contributions and a vast percentage of contributions from the dischargers, the permit holders on the river, and then also legislative proviso that was provided to help with the study that we're doing this year. The regulatory challenge, if you have something that's a 1.3 parts per quadrillion, there's no analytical method that can be used to determine compliance at this point. And in fact, the method that is legal for compliance determination is measuring PCBs in the parts per billion range, so that's really a big difference. It's very difficult to calculate loading in the river and to do load allocations because there's a very high uncertainty on those numbers. And so as a result, we're going down this task force approach, but it is outside the traditional approach. So whenever you do anything new, everything you do is kind of like, what do we do now? How do we do it? How do we agree on it? How do we move forward? And that collaborative aspect takes time. And I also mentioned that challenge with TSCA. And so we are actually talking with EPA about this regulation, and specifically we're looking at pigments. As Lynn mentioned, we do know that pigments are a source of PCB. It's inadvertently produced during manufacture. They don't add it. It's actually a chemical synthesis. And there are two different types of pigments that, actually three, that can have PCB in them. And so when we look at that, you know, why is there this huge difference? I think we also often forget that all of our regulations and laws are based on a sort of a risk management framework, but the reality is that they aren't the same risk management scenarios or assumptions. So if you look at the Clean Water Act, you're looking at a human health risk endpoint through fish consumption. And you're protecting vulnerable populations in your assumptions, all PCB congeners are created equally in that scenario because they accounted for it when they set the standard. And the disposal costs then are borne by anyone who has a permit, right? So it's the dischargers and the public are paying for disposal of PCBs that are produced by the manufacturers. And then we have the parts per quadrillion standard that results from those risk assessments. But if you go over to the TSCA side, you have an environmental and economic risk assessment, and the protections there include vulnerable industries. So if a product can't be replaced or a process can't be replaced, then TSCA will protect that industry. And that's what's happened with the pigment manufacturers specifically. And so it allows limited production of certain PCBs, up to 50 parts per million in pigments. The disposal costs then are externalized for those pigments, and by pigments I mean things that are in your program today. If that program goes to a paper recycler, it is the paper recycler who's paying for the cost of disposal, and that cost is paid for through the types of treatments that are needed in order to remove PCB before it gets into the water. And then the TSCA standards, as I mentioned, are in parts per million as opposed to parts per quadrillion. And finally, let me just wrap up with this thought. It is really important to measure progress, and I've heard that in a number of different presentations today. And I've heard a number of different ways of discussing what progress looks like. I've heard actually a third one, impact, or a fourth one on their impact. But in our case, we have the goal. What does it take to meet water quality standards? If we meet them, everybody's going to be happy and the goal's achieved, right? But if we don't have, if we measure it and we haven't met our water quality standards, then we have to take the next step. We have to ask the question, are we still working together collaboratively? And are we still producing outputs? Are we being productive? And are we seeing results? If at any time we get to this point where we just are not making progress, and primarily I would say the inputs and outputs question is very significant in that evaluation, then ecology would go back to that traditional TMDL approach. However, it's really in our interest to keep this process going because we want to see progress and we want everybody to be working together. So let's say we get to that point where we are seeing results, but we haven't got to the water quality standard yet, then we would do that adaptive management step. We would ask ourselves, how can we do better? We'd circle back to all the different things we're doing, all our inputs and our outputs, and see if there are ways we can make it a little bit better and get to our goal in a more effective way.